The alchemy for me is like it's like a blend between science and magic. And it's all about this venture to create something beautiful out of something ordinary. And the idea that in relationships you can take something that's seemingly ordinary to create something beautiful and connected and harmonious.
Today's guest on Success on the South Coast is Yvonne Guérineau, a relationship alchemist whose tech-free workshops have been called unexpectedly therapeutic.
I love that. Therapy is about healing, it's about processing things and getting to a better place than you started. And I think the reason my workshops are therapeutic is because I get that people are on a journey, especially if relationships are hard.
Yvonne is also the author of People in Their Element, a fantastic book on how to get gold from your working relationships. We discuss the importance of understanding each other's backstories, the implications of bringing your past to work, and how playing roller derby taught her to fully commit.
This is called a transition, this 180-degree turn. And what I realised is, in my head, in the split second before I had to say to myself, commit. If I didn't commit 100% to the turn, I ended up as a heap on the floor. You have to be willing to make the commitment.
Evie is really entertaining company, and if you enjoy the episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Welcome to a sunny new podcast where I'll be speaking to people from the arts, business and beyond, and shining a light on their stories of success on the South Coast. Welcome, Evie. Thank you so much for joining me today.
I am so looking forward to this conversation. Really looking forward to it.
Excellent. Me too. As you know from our other conversations, I've always been fascinated by relationships of all types, a bit like yourself, whether that be personal or professional. I'm not going to call myself a people person because I know you're not a fan of that phrase.
No.
And today we're going to be talking about your book, People in Their Element, a book I really enjoyed, and it just feels so good in the hand. I've told you that already. I'm very old school. I like my vinyl, I like my tactile things, and this is definitely very pleasurable. But before we get into the book and your work, we share a passion for digging deep.
We do.
Connecting the dots and getting right to the heart of things. So I'd like to dive straight in and understand, what are you passionate about?
Okay. Oh God, deep. Okay. So if we go deep, I think, like you already said, I think the passion thing is about energetically what I'm drawn to. So let's assume passion is what I'm energetically drawn to. And I'm definitely drawn to anything that is explorative. So I want to know things. I'm quite curious. I'm passionate about everything about how humans work. So whether that was biology when I was at school, or psychology when I did it as a degree to understand how the brain works, how people work. It's why I love murder mystery. I know we already had this before we went on air. The whole idea that I love murder mystery because good fiction writing gets to the heart of what makes people tick. Like a really good book, you feel you know people. And that anything to do with why we do what we do, how we do it, why it works that way, all of that totally captures me, whether it's health or behaviour or anything like that. I just love everything about how things work.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And like you say, we've got a shared love of murder mystery,
yes,
and probably rom-coms and things like that as well. When we talk about your business then, Golden Catalyst, how would you describe the work you do?
It's a good question. I describe it differently depending on who I'm talking to, but essentially it's how I bring what I believe is important, which is the need for human connection, into the workplace so that people get the benefit of having positive relationships with the people they work with. So Golden Catalyst is all about getting gold out of those interactions, which is what we've got on the book. It's all about recognizing that people are different, diversity is a good thing, but at the same time, we're all the same. Like, we all just want to be happy, we all want to get on, we all want to do well, we all want to be important, we all want to be understood. And with my work, what I do is I bring that into the workplace so that people get the best possible experience, and that I guess I sometimes say it's that the work isn't the hard work when it comes to the people work. That, you know, being with other people shouldn't be the hard bit. It is often challenging, but you don't go to work on that. That should be what smooths the working process.
That should be what makes the job more fun, right, ultimately, if you're with the right people.
Well, ask around. I mean, I don't know about you, but anybody I ask generally says, oh, that job was hard to leave. It wasn't the right job, but I didn't want to leave the people.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when a job is great, often it comes hand in hand with the people are great. I loved the people I work with. There was a camaraderie. It had a positive energy. We were high performing. It just worked. That's the sort of thing people say. They don't say, I really loved that spreadsheet.
No.
They don't.
And the opposite is true as well, isn't there? There's a lot of research about, you know, the classic people don't leave the job, they leave their boss and so on. So if you haven't got the relationships, it very much works in the other direction.
Oh, I mean, there's plenty of stories about people who couldn't wait to get out of a place. And it's often to do with the dynamics in the team or the manager. I think the boss often gets a hard rap because sometimes bosses are also people operating in a culture that's bigger than them, and they're responding to it and their hands are tied. It's a bit of a mixed bag, I think, always giving the boss the blame. But yeah, often it is that people leave people or culture.
So tell us a little bit then. A lot of your work is done through your workshops.
Yeah.
What can people expect when you come in and do one of those workshops?
So my workshops are all tech-free. So I'm a huge believer in real relationships happen between people. So you'd have to look each other in the eye. I bring an old-fashioned flip chart. We write on bits of paper with pens. People pack their laptops and their phones away. We will talk to each other. We will shuffle cards around. We will stand on a floor mat and walk up and down. There will be discussion. There'll be debate. I will share information. And essentially all of that is around getting to know each other better. It's about how we react to each other. It's about how different people see different things, respond to different things. Initially, it might involve some personality profiling, and that involves kind of learning the language of that profile and how to make the most of it. But when I go deeper with the team and we work beyond that first session, it might be, how do we really operate compared to how we think we operate? What am I bringing to the table? How do we respond under stress? How do we tackle change scenarios? Are we doing to the best of our ability? Are we getting the most out of each other? Are we learning from each other? Are we giving each other good feedback? It's all to do with the way we interact.
Yeah.
And the reason I do it all in person, if I can, sometimes logistically further down the line, that's harder. But certainly at the beginning, in person, tech-free, it's because once we energetically know that we're on the same page, once we energetically know that we have good intentions, which can be hard for some teams to get past, it's then much easier to progress some of the more challenging conversations that come later.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things and probably important things is organisations shouldn't be waiting until they've got a problem, right? I think you kind of make it clear that, you know, this is a proactive thing. Whilst the going's good, let's make things better. You don't necessarily have to think, oh, now I've got a crisis, let's bring Evie in.
Yeah, and actually the waiting until you've got a crisis is difficult, because when you've already got people on the back foot, when people are already protecting their position, when people are already afraid for their position, which often is what happens when conflict has got out of control, to get them to be vulnerable and open the way that I would like people to be to get the best out of it, you're uphill against resistance. So I think to look at it as kind of mediation of an existing problem is probably after the horse has bolted.
Yeah.
You want to get in earlier.
Have you been in that environment where you've been brought in and it's clear it's like the horse is bolted? You don't have to name names.
I will name no one. There is no naming and shaming in my world. Yes and no. Yes, I've seen it, but I now don't choose to work with businesses I don't think are ready.
Yeah.
So I think if there's a general feeling in the conversation that it's not going to be well received, or even in the first session when I meet a team, I think we've got resistance from people who are important to this process, then I will normally say we should put a break on it. Because there's no point, because if people don't respond well when they're in a place of resistance or fear.
No.
There's always one or two that we might need to support, but if particularly those in positions of control and power's a funny word, but those in a position of authority in a business to impact that in a big way, if they're not on board, then it's tricky to make it work.
Yeah. And I saw that your workshops have been described as unexpectedly therapeutic, which I just thought was great feedback. Why do you think that is?
I love that. It depends what you think about therapy. So, I mean, I've experienced therapy in my own life. Therapy is about healing. It's about processing things and getting to a better place than you started. And I think the reason my workshops are therapeutic is because, one, I get that. I get that people are on a journey, especially if relationships are hard. They need to hear that what they are experiencing is normal, that what they are feeling is okay, that the way they're behaving makes good sense given who they are and where they've come from. I normalize behavior. And I think for a lot of people, that might be the first time they hear it. I make things acceptable that maybe until now have not been acceptable to feel or think or do. I explain why people might think or feel or do that way, and that it's quite healthy and normal in that situation. So when they come through my workshop, often they come out the other end going, oh, I feel better for that. And that's the therapeutic experience. The I'm okay. We're all going to be okay. I'm not broken. My way's my way and your way's your way, and that's all right. And I think for a lot of people that is a healing process from maybe bad feedback they've had in the past or bad experience they've had in the past, and they need that space to be held for that to be all right.
A bit of reassurance.
Yeah, we all want to be normal, but we all want to be special. It's a really hard compromise.
Yeah, and I guess just having an opportunity maybe to vocalise some of this stuff as well.
Yeah.
They probably don't have that opportunity, so I'm sure that feels like therapy, just getting it off your chest.
Yeah, and sometimes they don't even have to get it off their chest. So the nice thing about the way I work, which can be quite hard to explain to people who haven't seen it in action, is that if I feel there's something that somebody needs to say, I will often say it on their behalf without them having to say it. So particularly when we talk about personality profiling, if I get a sense in the room that somebody feels put in a corner or someone is questioning the legitimacy of the way they operate, what I will often say is, and legitimately so, that someone with this kind of profile, someone who sees the world in this way, it would be quite normal for them to be thinking this. Then I can use that as an opportunity to look at the people, maybe one person, maybe several, who may be experiencing that. And often you get this moment of recognition that flies across their face. Something passes across their eyeballs. And I go, correct me if I'm wrong. And they will go, no, you're absolutely right. That is exactly how I feel. And then I can turn to other people in the room and say, but I wouldn't be surprised if you look at it this way, because you're very different, aren't you, in the way that you approach things. And they will go, yeah, I never looked at it like that before. And what you have is a connection that has been created without either of those people ever having to say, well, I thought that was weird and I thought you thought this. And so sometimes me tabling what someone might be thinking generates an opportunity for conversation where other people might not have ventured that off their own back.
It really does sound fascinating. It must be endlessly interesting being sat amongst and picking up on all these different personalities and all the dynamics going on, which kind of leads me to another question, because as I mentioned to you off camera, one of the things that immediately drew me to you and your work when I came across you was your LinkedIn, where you call yourself an alchemist and an author. And it wasn't lost on me that alchemist came first in that sentence. So why alchemist?
Can I just answer the author second bit first? I think the author did actually come second in reality, but I feel like because when you've got one book, you somehow don't, you are an author, but it takes a while for that to sink in. And I kind of feel like you're not really an author until you've got several, but maybe that's my own issue that I still have to deal with. But it's a whole different thing. But the alchemy, for me, is like it's like a blend between science and magic. It's early science, isn't it? It's early chemistry, the alchemy. And it's all about this venture to create something beautiful out of something ordinary. And the idea that in relationships, you can take something that's seemingly ordinary and or not even doing much to create something beautiful and connected and harmonious, that really appeals to me. I also like the idea that alchemy is science. I did a science degree. I'm interested in neuroscience and the science how the brain works. I love all that. But I'm also a bit magic. Like I have a spiritual edge to me. I like the fact that we can't explain everything with science, that sometimes we know and then science comes later and proves us right. So there's lots of things in nutrition and in areas of medicine. We're now coming full circle back to things that were done 70, 80, 90 more years ago that was intuitively handed through the generations, and now we scientifically can demonstrate why that might have been a good idea. So sometimes you have to trust in the magic of the knowing as well as the science. And I guess for me, the alchemy puts it together in a way that's sort of scientific, but not really. It's a bit of both.
I really love that. And you kind of touched on this a little bit already. Before we go into the book itself, I always find it interesting to understand about the individual behind that work, the backstory, which we're going to come on to much more later. You touched on it already, that you did a degree in psychology, and then following that you had a 20 plus year kind of career in HR,
which is amazing given that I'm only 25.
I know that I couldn't work out that math myself. How do you think that journey has kind of influenced what you do now?
I think we're all the result of the life we've lived. So, and it's odd because I remember this off-camera conversation we had before we started this. When I first did my psychology degree, the comments I got at the time were, that is a fashion subject. I could have done something more useful. That was in the day before, a psychologist had an opinion on anything and everything, and everyone invited a psychologist to the table, whether it was marketing or anything else. So that does fuel the decisions you make and the life that you have. So I've always been interested in kind of the sciencey side of it. The psychology degree obviously influences the way you look at things. Oddly, when I did the degree, I was more interested in the neuroscience than I was in the social psychology. And what I do now professionally is more on the social psychology side, although I feed the neuroscience into it. So I think every step of my life has kind of led me to this, but I didn't know it was going in this direction until I got here. It's really hard to explain.
Yeah.
I've kind of just followed the path thinking I was in charge, but actually probably it was as much in charge of me as I was in charge of it.
What led you into HR then? What took you down that path?
So HR was an interesting one. So in the day when I got into HR, it was called personnel.
I remember those days, even though I'm only 25 as well.
Even though you're also 25. It's amazing, isn't it, the memory? So I guess personnel had the word people more firmly in it. And coming out of the psychology degree, I wasn't really entirely sure what I wanted to do. I'd had some tricky personal experiences up to this point. I was not in a good place to go into clinical work. I didn't want to carry on with my education to go into clinical psychology, or generally to carry on with education at that point. I wanted to work. So I was looking around for how do I bring that interest into working life. And the general view was, well, that's with people, isn't it? So off I went. Into
a bit like
working.
Me, I ended up an accountant because I was good at math. So it's an easy it's an obvious step. Isn't it?
And you don't know half of what's available in the world of work when you first come out of education. Unless you've been exposed to it, you just don't know. And I was kind of advised in this direction. And I went in, and it was quite obvious as the years went by that it became more and more legalistic. It was a lot of law and process and not necessarily as people-y, although in a larger organisation you get more specialism. So in a smaller business it's quite versatile, and a larger business it's quite specialist. I always liked the combination of order and structure and process, but I found that I had more value as time went on, where I could unpick why we'd got into this position, not necessarily in fixing it afterwards. I could do it, but just because you can do something doesn't mean it's what you love doing. And I realised more and more that my passion was in, how do we get here? How do we get out of here? Why are they doing this? How do we get them to want to do this without manipulation? How do we get the best out of people in a way that they want to do what we think is good? All these things have kind of come together. And I guess when I left the world of HR, it was around the time of becoming a parent. So big swerve. And I realized as a parent, my energy is really focused back into developmental psychology, why people behave the way they do, why as a parent I reacted the way I did, why my child was developing the way he was developing, how that was all happening. And it swerved me firmly back into, yes, it's this developmental piece, why people do what they do, that completely grabbed me. So I left all the kind of compliance side of HR behind and focused all my attention on the kind of more proactive relationship side.
Well, you definitely made the right decision there, I think.
I hope so.
So I didn't cue that up, but it's a perfect transition into the book, isn't it? So let's talk about that. People in their element, how to create positive working relationships. How would you describe the book and what you're attempting to do with it?
So the book is in 3 sections. The first section is all about raising awareness that you're more complicated than sometimes you give yourself credit for as a person at work. That a relationship at work isn't just a set of transactions and you can learn the moves and dance the dance and it will all go seamlessly. So part 1 is all about why we're made up the way we are, how the brain works, how you carry all your history with you. If you live to 40, let's say you're a manager at work and you're 40, think about 40 years worth of experiences that are feeding into your relationships at work. So that first part is all about that exploration of who I am, how people are, how it all hangs together, how communication actually works and how much of it happens inside you as opposed to outside you. Because we talk a lot about the way you might communicate something, but all the things going on in your head and in your body, that all happens first. Then the second part is my process, just to explain to people really how I work, why I do things in the order that I do. If somebody wanted to try and explore this for themselves as a leader, as a manager, how they might do that with their team, the kind of things they want to think about, what I think about. So people kind of test that out for themselves. And then the third section of the book is case studies. So I've put together all these years of experience and I've packaged it into 3 sort of stories of teams that I've encountered and how this really works in real life. Because the truth is, it's never theory, it's always reality. And you need to sometimes see how that works in practice. Also, I'm very conscious that I work with personality profiles. So the book was designed in sections on purpose. The first one is the deep dive for people who really want to go exploring. The end is for those people who want to put all the pieces together. I have one person who peer reviewed the book who said, I don't normally read the appendix. I only read it because it was you. And I thought, yeah, I could see how somebody might skirt over that last section because they've got the message. They don't need to have it again rehashed in 3 different versions. But different people want different things. So it's designed to give different people a different experience if they want that.
Yeah.
And I've also put activities in throughout so that people will stop and think. And the feedback I've had a lot from people who've read the book is those activities throughout were a great kind of reset to go, actually, where do I stand on this? So they kind of then naturally geared to come to a point when you might just stop and reflect on what you've just read, as opposed to at the end of the chapter necessarily always when you've passed over something quite important, and I wouldn't want to let that go until you've had a chance to process it.
Yeah, that's true, actually. I hadn't actually kind of even registered it, but subconsciously I totally get that because it does feel like I've come across a few moments where you put a few questions to ask yourself and you do sit there at that point and just reflect for a moment before you move on. So I think the book works really well. I mean, I really enjoyed it. I wanted today, though, to hone in. I mean, we could spend, hours going over all of the chapters, but today I really wanted to talk about, as I mentioned, the chapter about bringing your past to work. You
Yes.
talked about it a little bit already. And in the book, you talk about how these millions of tiny moments have shaped who and how we are today. And what I found really interesting is the start of that chapter. I think there's a quote from Dalai Lama, and it's you talk about that our shared desire to have a good life free of suffering is the reason you do what you do. But the interesting thing about that chapter is that it's all about exploring the differences and why that's so important if we want to reduce friction and improve those relationships. So it's a big question, and you could probably spend an hour answering it. But how would you summarize the impact of someone's backstory on their working relationships?
So it's a difficult chapter, isn't it? Because it's actually quite heavy.
Yeah.
There's quite a lot of... it's potentially quite triggering for some people, the kind of things that it asks you to explore. I think when it comes to backstory, I think we just have to recognise that from the minute you're born, you're exposed to other human beings. So whether you have a caregiver who coos over you or pretty much does the minimum, whether your teachers are supportive of your education or tolerate you, whether you make friends at school or you don't quite feel that you found the right people, whether you have a line manager in a job that you love who cares about your development or just expects you to do what you're told, all these experiences that you have, they all build up to the person that you become. Layer that on top of how the brain works, which we understand much better than we did 20 years ago, but honestly it's still a bit of a minefield. People are still arguing and disagreeing and forming opinions on how that works. So when you piece all that together, what you get is this complete matrix of experiences and moments and memories and feelings and interpretations of all the things that have happened to you, that whether you like it or not, or whether you even realise it's happening or not, are feeding into your interactions. So for example, if I meet you and we've never met before, and the only people I've ever met as tall as you are horrible, I see you and you're tall and I think, oh, it's another one of them, and I might not even realise I'm doing it.
Yeah.
Or if
it's like the example you gave of in your earlier days when you saw a tattoo and made an assumption about people.
Yes, tattoos. I mean, and the conversation is ongoing. Yes, I saw an article the other day about how apparently now tattoos are a sign of wealth or status. I'm like, really? They used to be a sign of ship dwelling. It was a different thing. But things move on. But this is one of the challenges with generations as well in the workplace. People in different generations have lived very different lives. Like if you're a post-war child, you had a very different experience of having and not having, and fear and injury and privilege than if, for example, you grew up 20, 30 years later. But other problems, you would have grown up without social media and the challenges that the generation have faced about being constantly on display and everyone judging your every move and being photographed everything you do and it posted up on the internet for general consumption. So you have a different life experience and it all feeds into the way you show up. But I think a lot of people don't know how much of this is underlying the decisions they make. They don't realise why they get nervous in certain situations. They don't realise why certain people irritate them, who that reminds them of, why certain situations they avoid. They just haven't asked the question. And it's not right or wrong, but what I'm saying is you should encourage people to explore this a little bit, because it makes life a lot easier if you know why you do what you do. Not because you have to dig deep into everyone's life story, but if you know that you have a bad reaction to people who look a certain way or behave a certain way or talk a certain way, then you have half a chance of improving that relationship that you didn't have before that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, you kind of mentioned in a way the science and the biology is against us as well. You've got all of your personal experiences, but there's also all of this subconscious stuff going on that I guess just to be aware of is the first step in terms of dealing with that as an individual and trying to be better. So after the chapter where you look at backstory, you move on to the bit what's on your mind, where you start exploring some of these schemas, which are these mental frameworks that we use to organize our worlds, kind of like a mental filing system. And heuristics.
Good word.
Yeah, it's a great word, isn't it? I think I said it about correctly. These are mental shortcuts that help people make decisions. I thought it's worth probably talking about a couple of those because they are fascinating, aren't they, when you actually see them? And I think we'd all probably recognise ourselves in some of them.
Yeah. I mean, there's more that I haven't covered. I kind of, skirted across the surface of these.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Do you have any particular favourites then that you think we should be aware of?
Oh, I don't know. Favourites.
Or shall I throw out some?
Come on, throw one out and see what happens.
So I think I'll say it's an odd word. Representativeness.
Okay. What did that do for you when you saw it?
I think it's one of those things that probably people are maybe more aware of, isn't it? It's almost like pattern recognition, a bit like you said with your terrible experience of meeting lots of horrible tall people.
I haven't, by the way, met lots of horrible. It was just an example.
You met lots of lovely tall people.
So yeah, I mean, representativeness. What did I write about it in the book? Let me just check what I said so I don't contradict myself.
I don't have all the details here, but I think it was around the pattern recognition and just saying that if you've seen that kind of person or that behaviour before and you see something that reminds you of it, you just assume. I think there's the example in there about a description of a guy and you're all led to believe that it's a librarian.
I guess the word representative is like a label you put on it, I guess. I was just trying to think what example I used in the book, actually. But it's the idea behind it is that you put the component pieces together. So I sometimes do it in a workshop where I draw an image on a flip chart and I'll say, what is it? And essentially what you do is you close the gaps, literally in the picture. And it's exactly the same with this, is if I said to you, and I often use this example, so I might say to you, accountant. Yes, because we've talked about this in numbers. What do? People form the rest of the picture. So even as we're talking now, anybody who's listening, anyone who's watching, I've said the word accountant, they've got an image.
They've all turned off.
I don't know about turn it off, but they've all got a picture. It might be an emotionally charged picture, it might be a nothing charged picture, it might have certain colours attached to it, it might have certain behaviours attached to it, but that's because you kind of use this representation of what an accountant is, and it's useful because if you didn't have that, you'd spend forever trying to piece all the pieces together, and it's not in your interest. And this is where these shortcuts, when you said earlier they play against you. The reason they play against you is because they're a survival system, but you're not necessarily in that moment in survival mode. You're doing something more complex than just pure survival. And the reason it serves you in survival is that the faster you know whether it's lunch or your lunch, the faster you're out of there or engaging in a positive way, yes? So you need to know quite quickly, is it an accountant or is it not an accountant, in the sense it's going to keep you alive. Now that's great when it's actually properly life-threatening, like is that sound an emergency siren or is it bird song? But with an accountant, if you have the alarm siren reaction for reasons that you can't quite explain, when actually it's bird song, you're not going to deal with that person the way you would have maybe benefited from dealing with them. So this kind of representative thing is all about knowing the label knowing what the label means to you and how you take that apart.
I guess in a way it's a little bit like stereotyping, isn't
Completely,
it?
yes.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, in the scientific world, these phrases will have descriptions properly attached to them. I think what I'm not interested in is so much as getting the science exactly right, and I don't want to, you know, undo anybody's good work around it. But the key here is, how does this serve me? Not exactly what is the research and what's it called and what does it do. Yeah,
and the concept certainly makes sense. Yeah. Another one that just amusing, the better than average effect.
Oh, I love this. Okay, so if I had to have a favourite, I do quite like this one.
Yeah, this is a good one.
Yes, better than average. Isn't it amazing how we all like to be better than average, but statistically that doesn't work? Yes, I mean you're good at maths, right? If you've got 10 people and 7 of them think they're better than average, it doesn't work. Mathematically, it doesn't work. Average means middle, therefore half have to be above and half have to be below. I mean, you can get into the whole mean and, you know, the rest of it.
But despite that, apparently 70% of men think they're above average intelligence.
Isn't that interesting?
I'm definitely one of those.
You are, and how right you might be. So, but you know, who's measuring the thing? But again, it's useful, isn't it? Because you potentially wouldn't be very happy if you always thought you were in the bottom category, but someone has to be, because you can't be above average unless somebody's below average, because it's a balancer. But yeah, lots of us are running around thinking we're above average, but you don't know. And in relationships, this is challenging. Because if I think I'm above averagely good at giving you feedback, I'm less likely to work on it because I think I'm already pretty good.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're sitting there going, you're in the below average category, you're looking at me going, you really think you should work on that, but you can't see it. So it's a bit of a blinker.
Yeah. It's kind of relates to, is it Dunning-Kruger, that kind of thing, isn't it? Where you don't know how little you know.
I mean, there's so many of these things, and again, you know, I covered some of them in the book and I didn't cover others, but essentially there are so many little quirks. Like you measure more what somebody does based on what they're actually, their personality, whereas you're more likely to judge yourself on your intentions. Surprise.
I was just about, I think, is that the fundamental attribution error? I love this one as well. That's another favourite. So if someone else does something wrong, you think, it's because they're a bad person. But if I do that same thing, it's because our circumstances were against me. It was all out of my control.
It was out of your control. Unless it's, positive or negative scenarios skew that though.
Yeah.
And again, I don't know, you know, scientifically, there's probably some research to say that in some scenarios this doesn't work. I mean, there's plenty of research on all of these kind of topics, these heuristics and these models and all this sort of thing. I think the key here isn't, am I above average or below average? Am I judging other people more harshly than I'm judging myself? The question has to be, have I asked myself why I think what I think? Have I asked myself where this comes from? Do I even agree with this? What's my evidence? I'm not saying you have to be a complete scientist and dissect your every move, but if you never ask yourself, is it maybe me? Or am I maybe overestimating this? Or am I being as fair on this person as I'm being on that person? If you never ask yourself these questions, it will get in the way of your relationships because people will judge you too in the way you're judging them.
And I was going to ask you that, what are the tips, you know, how would you recommend people go about trying to combat the fact that all these things are going on? And I guess it is that really, it's being aware, asking yourself those type of questions.
I guess the way I go around it is I always think to myself, why am I here? What's really happening here? I often say to in workshops, imagine turning on CCTV and then turn the sound off. And then go back and then turn the visuals off, and what's really going on here? Like, could you, if you can disagree what's happening, then you've put a slant on it. If actually you can absolutely agree that the thing went from left to right, or the voice went up or got louder or got quieter, if that's not up for discussion, everything else is my interpretation. So the more you can begin to kind of take a step back, which is maybe why we like the murder mystery thing. If you take a step back and you look as an observer at what's happening, if you're not emotionally engaged and it's not affecting you, isn't it amazing how clear things are? So if you have to almost look at your life as a bystander. So if you're having a disagreement with somebody or you're relating to someone in a certain way, stand back and imagine if I was watching this as the neighbour from the window, what would I see? And that's when reality often kicks in. Like if I really lined myself up against another 10 people, would I really be in the top percentage point? Or am I not really above average? Who am I actually comparing myself to? Bearing in mind, comparison has its own challenges. So who am I calibrating against? Am I calibrating like for like? Am I comparing myself only to great people? Am I comparing myself only to people I know are below average and underperforming to come out on top? These questions you have to ask yourself. And relationships are complicated. And I think it's tempting to either overcomplicate your strengths or overrate your strengths, and in some cases to underrate yourself, because there are a lot of people who also underrate themselves. And to just spend a bit of time on that. And if it's hard for you, to kind of ask other people for input for that.
Yeah, no, it's really good advice, because I think we've all been there, haven't we, in a situation where it's so easy to give other people amazing advice, isn't it? And then you think, would I actually take that myself? It's much more difficult in a way. Sorry to interrupt the chat. Just a quick one to ask a favour. If you're enjoying this episode, then please rate, review or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Now back to the episode. So I just want to kind of continue down this path, because whilst we have your wisdom here, I feel like we should, for the benefit of everyone listening, get some more tips and advice for individuals, because I know you do a lot of work with businesses and teams, but at the end of the day, we're all individuals that make up those teams and businesses. And I wanted to discuss potential pitfalls and, best practice for people to be aware of. And that's either leaders or people that are just in teams at work. Because I read another interesting post on your LinkedIn, actually, which was, we should not be treating others the way we would like to be treated ourselves. And that's such a traditional phrase that we've all grown up with, but actually you reframed that rule to say that we should be treating others the way they would like to be treated. So I just wonder, that's such a fundamental thing that we've all heard. What are the other kind of common mistakes, if you like, that you see, or challenges people face finding their element?
I think the treating people the way we want to be treated, I think, it's a really big one, and it underlies a lot of what I do. I think people mean respectfully. What they forget is that that's open to interpretation. And I think it's the same with assumptions. So I'm big on assumptions and challenging assumptions. Like, a bit like we just said, I measure you and think, oh, well, he's late because he's just lazy or slow or disorganized. Whereas I'm late because there was a traffic jam and, something else was going on that got in the way. So how are you... Never make the assumption that you know what someone's thinking. Never make the assumption that you know what's going on for somebody. Be prepared to be wrong. Assumptions we make because it helps, it's faster, it's easier to assume X led to Y, led to Z, but actually it gets in the way. So the assume thing is a big one. To stay away from that. I'm just saying, think of the kind of things that come up. I mean, don't treat people the way that you would want to be treated. Don't assume you know of someone's intentions. I think the other thing is that there's more than one way to do something. I think that's maybe a life lesson for a lot of people. I often come across managers who had a system that worked for them for a while and isn't working anymore. And I think the idea that there's one answer, I think is so flawed. Because one, you're either always in search of it, and it's like the holy grail of getting it right and you never get there. Or you get stuck in what you think is working and you don't try anything else. And people change and you change, and therefore you have to move with the time. And there's a kind of a playfulness to it, I guess, where you have to be willing to keep moving the goalposts. And I know a lot of people hate that. They hate the idea that the goalposts will move. They want an answer, they want something that works, and they want it to keep working. Yeah. But I mean, I've been married for nearly 20 years, and even though I'm married to the same person and we haven't really changed, I'm not the same person and he's not the same person. And actually we do a lot of things differently that we did back then. And you kind of have to keep moving all the time and keep reassessing. So you can never assume you've got the answer, and you can never assume you know someone. You always have to assume you don't know somebody, and you have to go back and keep re-inviting new information.
Yeah.
So don't ever, I think it's one of those things, don't ever assume you've got the gist. Like, you don't ever assume you know what someone's like.
It's almost like you don't rest on your laurels as well. Don't just assume because it worked yesterday, it's going to work tomorrow. Because like you say, these systems of people are living, breathing organisms of their own, aren't they?
Yeah.
And there's changing factors, you know, in your own personal relationship, the arrival of kids and things completely changes it. Your behaviour changes. So it stands to reason.
I think I saw a TED talk a few years ago about how we think, something to do with how much we really think we've changed in 60 years and how much we do actually change. We underestimate how changed we become. And I think you notice it with children. Like, if you don't see a child for a long time, you go, gosh, they've grown. It's so automatic. But I don't look at you and think, I've known you for 10 years, haven't you changed?
Yeah.
Because we kind of make the assumption that we know someone.
It's also so subtle over time, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like you don't see yourself when you look in the mirror every day, but if someone hasn't seen you for 10 days, it's massively different what they see.
Yes.
I thought another interesting kind of piece of context for this was actually to discuss just how important this area is about relationships. And a piece of research I came across previously, I think it might have been speaking to Nick Fewings actually, who we talked about earlier, but I think he was the one who brought my attention to it originally, which was this piece of research conducted by Harvard University, and I think it was like in 1918 or something. But they concluded that 85% of job success comes from having well-developed soft and people skills. And I know, like, people either like or don't like the soft and hard skills piece. But only 15% of job success comes from technical skills and knowledge, the so-called hard skills. So it does kind of just emphasize that this is a really important aspect of not only just getting along with people and making your day more pleasant, but actually how successful you're going to be. And I mean, you can argue about the exact percentage, but it feels to me, my instinct is that feels true.
This is the difference between the science and the magic, right? That we talked about earlier. You intuitively know it's right. And the reason it probably feels intuitively right is because you know from your experience that learning to write is all very well, but that doesn't mean people respond to what you've written the way that you would have liked. That's how marketing, is a subject that's quite complex, because it's not about whether you can put pen to paper or put, fingertip to keyboard. That's the skill bit. You can have all this knowledge of vocabulary and how to grammatically string a sentence together, but the message is way more complicated. And I think that's what this is about. There's the ability to formulate words and to utter them across the room, but there's the nuance of tapping into the interaction you have with the person. And that's the soft skill. That's the eye contact. That's relating to somebody. That's generating enough space for someone else to speak, that's picking up on the subtle messages that someone wants to move on, and they've tired of this topic and they want to move on to something else, or that they feel uncomfortable. The reading the room, the creating safe space, the making people feel heard, the knowing how to get your emotions across in a way that is appreciated and understood from the other party. That's the soft skill that I call more powerful in many ways. You can teach a lot of animals to do certain maneuvers, but this is much harder to do. And I think that's why the results are there, because it's more subtle, it's more nuanced, it's more about fine-tuning than just about hitting a hammer on a nail. And
this leads me on to one question that I'm always fascinated by in this area, and that is, do you believe that individuals can actually get better at this stuff? Because this is like, I think the kind of jury's out, like whether we're not going to call them people persons, but there's this sort of feeling that some people have just got a natural ability to build relationships. And I think on the flip side, we've all probably had those experiences with people where perhaps they're not naturally that way inclined, and somehow we have again this inbuilt mechanism to kind of sense insincerity from a person who comes in and starts going, oh, like, Evie, how are you feeling today? Did you have a nice weekend? When you can sense they really don't care, but they've read a book that says you've got to pay an interest in people.
Yes.
So can people get better at this stuff?
Absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. I think the most damaging ones are the ones that think they're good at it when they're not. But it's like it's like the people who think they can cook and nobody wants to eat their food. I think the danger is assuming you're great. That's always a danger. And then not putting any effort in. Often the people who are really good at the ones that have to put effort in. So they've learnt it, so they understand how it works. They're not just winging it. Don't get me wrong, I think some people are interested. Like, if you're interested in something, you'll read up about it, you'll pay attention, you'll naturally engage with the topic. So I think some people are naturally tuned to wanting that kind of interaction, looking for that, developing those skills. I certainly have had to get better over time, even though I was interested. Yes, so maybe I'm so anti the people person thing, because I used to think I was a people person because I like people, but I was rubbish at interacting with people. Or at least I didn't get the reactions that I wanted, which is a whole different ballgame. But yes, I think you can get better. I think communication is a process. The better you know yourself, the better you understand other people, the more you think about why things are happening the way they're happening, the more likely you can begin to influence the process. So if you think you're not naturally good at this, you can start to take the component parts and start working on why that might be happening, paying attention to why people respond to you the way they do, focusing on the vocabulary that you use, which words have certain reactions. Somebody said something to me the other day about, the lies from this industry, and I thought, well, just the word lies, that immediately gets a reaction that you wouldn't get from the difference of opinion that you get. And I know people are a bit anti the vanilla kind of be a bit on the fence thing, but actually you don't always want a big reaction from somebody. So learning what vocabulary sparks that, these are all things that you can learn. It's great if you're naturally inclined this way and you find it easy, but even people who find it easy, or they think they find it easy getting on with everyone, will still hit at some point somebody they find challenging. Yeah. And at that point, they have to be willing to dig into it a little bit and learn some skills.
Yeah, no, that's really good. I was interested in your book when you start talking about that process, because I'd not really thought about it in that way. And I think one of the real simple pieces of advice that I think is really important actually was just making time for it. I think it says, actually think about making time for this, because I guess that's another challenge in the modern world, isn't it? Everyone's so busy rushing from one meeting to another, and there's not those moments. You have to almost make sure you have those moments to connect with your team and get to know them, that probably we had more opportunity for, especially when people are all working in an office, the water cooler moments that you don't get as much when everyone's sat behind their screens working remotely.
I think as well that, I don't know when it happened and how it happened, and I'm not an expert in this, but there does seem to be an association between how much you do and that makes you a success. That if you churn out a lot of stuff or attend the most meetings, you have delivered the most, when in reality, some of the biggest achievements, if you look at people who have been successful over a longer period of time, those achievements have come in the gaps when there was space to breathe. And I don't know about your experience of this, but I find if you create space, things move into the space. And especially as a parent, when I have more availability, when I'm mentally more available and more present, my son will come to me with things that I didn't know he was thinking about. because maybe I wasn't showing myself as available at the time. So as soon as that space is there, he will come into that space. I know other parents have had a similar experience. The more available they are, the more everything seems to work. And I'm not saying this is a judgment of who should work and who shouldn't work. It's not about that. It's about mental availability and being accessible. And in work context, if everyone's running from meeting to meetings and there is no available space where, and I think this is where the water cooler thing comes from, where we're just in transition between one thing and another, nothing can move into the space. So if there is no space, nothing can move into it. So the little conversations, the little moments when I spot whether your head is lower than normal or whether you're more agitated or more fidgety than you normally are, those things I miss.
Yeah.
And those are where the opportunities for connection lie.
I completely agree, because I think like one of the bad things about the modern world is like the calendar, that now we can be booked. Like you just look for a slot, right, and every slot is filled up, and like you say, there is no transition. It's hang up from that video call on to the next one, and it's just relentless. You don't have that space.
I've certainly built transition into my calendar.
Yeah.
Because I need the time to switch off from one thing onto the next. And if you haven't, I mean, not everyone has the power to do this. Some people are required to do certain things, and that's, you know, for the company culture to resolve. They don't always necessarily have the ability to change that. But if you have any power to build holding time in, it's a bit like everyone has their phone in their hand in the queue for something.
Yeah.
It's like, but that used to be the time when you didn't have anything to do and you'd look around.
Yeah, and you'd come up with amazing ideas.
There's a reason people have good ideas in the shower.
Yeah.
Because they don't take their phone in. Well, maybe some people do. But it's that moment in the shower where your whole focus is on, I'm here in kind of nothingness mode.
Yeah.
The only thing that happens here is me and water. You don't have your phone. You don't have a screen. You don't have 20 other things to do. Like your brain runs wild.
Yeah.
And it's in those creative, free moments that good things happen. But if you never create those free moments for relationships, then none of that can happen in your interactions either. Whether it's your interaction with the world or your interaction with somebody else, you need a holding bay for people to slip into it and go, oh, what could happen? Which I guess is why my workshops are tech-free, because people have to be in the room and experience an emotion and experience the moment.
Yeah, I love that. When I read it, I think you say screen free on your LinkedIn, and I just thought it's funny how refreshing just that simple idea feels in the year 2025.
Yeah, and it really isn't though, is it? No, it's actually quite retro.
Yeah, exactly. It's crazy. We maybe kind of touched on this a little bit already, but your book, it's focused on working relationships. Do you think you can apply the same approaches and lessons to personal, even romantic relationships?
No agenda. Totally. I mean, relationships are relationships. All I would say is in your home life, it's more, the emotions will be different. So I totally apply this. In fact, a lot of the learning and research that I've done in the last few years has come off the back of being a parent, because you read differently. You have different responsibilities. You notice your reactions to things that maybe you never reacted to before. I apply this at home in my marriage, not always so well, because again, we all have our own interests, and when we go home and we switch off, often they don't get the best version of us that we polish up nicely and present to the office.
Do you get your husband go, you're doing that thing from chapter 4 on me again, aren't you?
No. Well, no. We definitely know that we're doing it. You know, I think we've both, as a relationship, we've definitely benefited. We've benefited from the fact that I take the step back and I say, I think this is what's happening. We certainly have benefited as parents from the fact that I say, well, all behaviour is communication. And in children, that's particularly clear because they cannot articulate and they don't have the frontal lobe development in their brain to always be considered in their approach. So children who get a fast reaction very fast, without the kind of delay that adults often will build in if they feel they've got control over it. So, the conversations about what does this behaviour mean? What is this child communicating? How are we responding to it? What from our lives are we responding to here? All these things feed into that, and I bring that back into work because really grown-ups are just kids that got bigger
Yeah.
I really do think that.
And I must admit, I mean, I always feel like I should be taking notes when we're talking about this stuff, but I really liked what you said about the reason why a kid will prod and then prod because they're just intrigued by the reaction.
But you're the same. So the reason that people post things on LinkedIn or on any kind of social media, people say you have to stop people in their tracks, you have to catch someone's attention. That's the kind of the first interest kind of gauge. And that's because, we like things that catch us off guard. The reason that works is because it's in our interest, because it could be dangerous, right? Back to this whole survival instinct that is kind of programmed into us. So when we see something unexpected, we react to it because we need to work out whether it's dangerous or not. Therefore, if you do something and it's out of the ordinary and a child looks at you and goes, that's odd, because normally he smiles, but he didn't smile when I did that, they will have another go. Just to see whether it was a one-off, yes? Honestly, ask anyone who's got children. I know yours is still quite young. Ask anyone with children, they will say, yes, kids can press your buttons. And the reason they press your buttons is because they want to see what happens. And if they don't get a reaction that they expect, they will almost explore it further until they can work out what that's about. So they will rile you and you won't even know you're on, you won't even know you're on that train. Often until you're 3 steps into being riled, because they're just exploring, they're just testing you. They're product testing you, the parent, really. That's what kids are doing. And people are doing it at work. People are doing it everywhere. We're always kind of testing each other, even if we don't realise we're testing. Like you say, they didn't get the reaction from that person I expected. Or let's try this and see what the customer thinks. Because it's a constant testing ground, which I guess is why I look at my work as quite playful, even though it's a serious subject, because you have to test stuff, you have to play with it and see what happens.
Yeah, no, I love that. The last question I had in this section, we were talking the other day, and I'd not really thought about this before, but we were talking about the fact that people are actually starting to use AI tools like ChatGPT to handle their relationships and help them out with maybe difficult emails or writing text messages to break up with their partners. What do you make of that? I was just kind of stunned by that idea.
Well, I'm not the generation of, breaking up with somebody on AI coded message. What do I think of it? I've used ChatGPT or whatever version of whatever I've come across. I completely see the benefits. I mean, if we didn't have AI, we wouldn't have Google Maps. So there's lots of things that we've benefited from in the world of AI. But I think getting someone else to write your message loses a depth of meaning. Like what am I trying to say here? You're more than just the words that you write. You're the intention that sits behind it. You're the nuance in the way that you present your information. And actually, quite frankly, you have to have the courage to stand by who you are. So the idea of messaging somebody or writing a message to part company in somebody else's language sounds a bit cowardly, really, to me. I think if you're going to give someone the time to begin with, you have to give someone the time at the end. Yeah. It's a long time since I've done it. Like I said, I've been married a long time. But I think the idea of writing it down might be good to start a conversation. You might want to write, I'm going to find this hard to say, so I just want to get this out now and then we'll talk about it. Because maybe the other person would argue back, or you're afraid you're not going to get, or maybe you just don't think you're going to be able to get the words out. So writing it down is fine. But getting a machine to represent you, I struggle with. If you want to put it in and get some ideas for how to articulate something and then rewrite it in your own language, that's fine. But I'm a bit anti-hiding behind a machine. But then, here I am doing workshops without technology, because again, I don't want you people to hide behind a machine.
Yeah.
You've got to bring your whole person.
I think it is. I mean, we kind of joke a little bit about that scenario of breaking up with someone. It's like that sending a text message thing, isn't it? But just even worse. But I guess I'm thinking just from a wider point of view, the fact that, what does it say about people that they're relying on ChatGPT or something to have these kind of really important conversations, and that might be even within the workplace. But this can't be good in terms of developing your ability to communicate and build relationships, because you don't have it in your pocket when you have an interaction with somebody, do you, face to face? So it's a dangerous direction to go, people sat behind their computers remotely, and if it is true that people are starting to rely on that technology.
I think anything you rely on is potentially problematic. A bit like sat-nav in a car. I still like knowing where I'm going. If you follow blindly the sat-nav, who knows where you're going to be? And if the whole thing then stops, how do you know where you are? I mean, could you even call the emergency services and say where you are if you don't know on a map which part of the country you're in? So the minute you over-rely on something, you're potentially shortchanging yourself, because you've lost your ability to apply some logic to it, some nuance, some personality. You lose the essence of you, I think. And you lose choice. I think you lose options. A bit like with the sat-nav, you lose the choice to turn off here and take the back way, because you only know this way because that's what's programmed. You don't even know where that goes.
Because you know better than Google.
Well, sometimes you do really know better than Google. But if you rely heavily on AI to write your messaging, what you're losing is knowing how you feel about that message and bringing yourself to that message and being able to handle it if someone walks up to you. I think some of the anxiety that people have around communication is they've forgotten how. I mean, I even put a post out in my inner circle, which is kind of my newsletter, the other day about social risk taking. And I specifically said, when we were young, here we go, here's the old story of when I was young. But when we were young, if you wanted to talk to your friend, you had to pick up a phone, call a number, and a grown-up that wasn't your family member would answer the phone, and you would have to negotiate getting your friend to the telephone. So you had to deal with a stranger that you couldn't see, and you had to be able to handle that. Kids were expected to negotiate their own way to the till and ask for something. They are expected to deal with the neighbours. Kids now get their mum or their dad to WhatsApp the friend's mum to organise a play date. They don't even know how to respond to these adults. Schools are having to teach children to acknowledge grown-ups in the hallway, because a lot of them are not getting this exposure. So the more we rely on the technology, the less we will be able to do what nature intended, which was the kind of more animal basic interaction, which is for survival. But your brain is processed and wired for survival. And this is all the stuff we talked about earlier. You're designed to deal with interaction. Therefore, if you remove all that, you're basically removing some really basic need and ability that you need to function well.
We could talk about this all day. It's a really interesting subject. I mean, I'm reading a lot about similar things, like people losing the ability to flirt now because they're just swiping left and right, and you lose that. Back in the day, you had to fail, right? You had to embarrass yourself, making yourself look a fool. But over time, maybe you were able to, like you say, improve those skills a little bit. And now that kind of training ground is kind of gone in a way.
And in many ways, I mean, I don't know how accurate this is, and I don't know if there's any research, but all of that kind of flirting, seeing what happens if you say this, seeing what reaction you get from someone if you do that, all that, if that's not happening anymore, where does that leave someone when they get to work and they have to get to know their work colleague? Because if you had to negotiate that as a child and as a teenager, when you then get to work, you already know that phrase doesn't land well. And you know what the response looks like when that didn't go the way you thought it was going to go. You've had some practice. And you've had some practice at seeing what happens when you raise your voice and you're louder and you're quieter, and you've learnt that in this scenario, this is how you communicate, and in that scenario, you communicate differently. And this generation finds that acceptable, but this generation thinks that's weird. Unless you've had those interactions in different environments, you don't get the practice. So then you arrive at work and you wonder why it's not working. Because you had no practice.
So true. Let's change tack a little then. there's a ton of research suggesting that a really strong link between social connections and happiness. We talked about a little bit off camera earlier that a lot of these studies even demonstrate that good relationships lead to better health and even living longer.
Yeah.
And as you know, one of the themes of this podcast is happiness. What is it and how do we get it? And I always say to people, happy, it's such a small word, a small word that kids learn, probably one of the first words, but it can seem really complex in the modern world. Like, what does that mean? So I always like to ask guests, like, what do you think is the true meaning of happiness, or perhaps fulfilment is a different word for it?
God, that is big. So I think, I'm similar to you. I've always been interested in the whole process of happiness and where it comes from. And the quote that you had earlier from His Holiness the Dalai Lama, that's from the book The Art of Happiness. So that was the first time I came to realise that pleasure and happiness are very separate things. And sometimes we do something in the moment we think is going to make us happy, but what we really think is it's going to give us some pleasure, but long term, it will not lead to happiness. So for me, happiness is about something that is lasting, that runs deep, not something that is superficial. So it's not being pleased with something. It's not loving the moment or being excited about something. It's more of a foundation of knowing that I'm okay, that I'm safe, that everything's fine, that I'm enough, that there is purpose and meaning in my life. I think that's where a lot of the research has gone as well, which I follow with huge interest. It's about appreciating what you have. It's about the perspective that you put on what happens to you, how you interpret what's going on around you. I'm still on that journey. I haven't completely sussed this for myself by any means. But I think the more time goes by, the more I think happiness is this calm, quiet place where you don't need more and you don't need different and you're okay with what you have. In the world of business, where it's always growth, grow more, expand here, scale this and build that, I think that's quite counterintuitive to what actually the more time goes by I see is what happiness really is, which is actually accepting what you have and being okay with it. Not because you lose ambition and not because you don't aspire to do something or you challenge yourself, but because the challenge is a positive challenge, not a challenge that comes from lack. Like I want to do it because I'm interested, or because I enjoy it, or because there's an opportunity and I'm opportunistic. Not to be confused with I feel I should, or until I have this I'm not. There's a difference, I think, between the two. So I think calm is a calm still place is a happy place rather than an excitable high flying place.
Excellent. I really, really like that answer.
I like that answer too, actually.
Yeah,
I might go back and write that down now that I've said it.
You won't have to. You'll have it on video.
I shall write it down and keep it somewhere safe in case I forget.
And equally, success is another one of the themes. Clearly, the name of the podcast, it says it on the tin. And particularly, like when I started this, I really wanted to kind of dispel the myth of success, the way it's portrayed in social media. We've kind of touched on that a little bit already.
Yeah.
So how would you describe what success means to you?
I've certainly moved on what I think success is. I definitely came from a place of success is the job and the title and the money and all the rest of it. The more time goes by, the more I think that success is when you get this happiness thing in perspective. The more I think success is about relationships that work, where they serve me and I serve them, where I wake up in the morning and I'm okay with what I have and I like what I have and I enjoy what I'm doing. I actually wrote down a few years ago that success for me in business is doing what I love doing and doing it most of the time and with people whose company I enjoy. So I think that gives me plenty of choice for what I do and how I do it. but it means at least I can be less hung up on the numbers and the metrics, more meaning rather than metric. Not because these things don't matter, and you do need some measures in life, especially in business. You need to be able to measure things, but not instead of the other things. So I think for me, success is going to be much more about my personal experience rather than ticks in boxes. But as I said, I've come away from that. That wasn't the case 20 years ago.
Well, I think that's also really interesting to me. I think that's something I've really explored on this podcast, and I think that's quite, relatively common. I hear that all the time. People at 20, your definition of success is completely different to what it is when you're like 25 now. It changes as time goes on.
Those 5 years make all the difference.
They make a massive difference. But yeah, I think that's really important. I want that to be a lesson for people listening, and I kind of also, I'm kind of wrestling with it myself a little bit in terms of all of these things. How are they linked? Happiness, fulfilment, success. Are they even different? It's a kind of interesting subject. I'm still not 100% clear how I feel about that, but it's an interesting few areas to be exploring.
I think that's where with time I get better and better now at taking an interest in people who are significantly older than me. When you listen to an interview with someone who's 100 talking about what matters, they have a perspective that you cannot begin to imagine having when you're 20. The world is a different place. Like when I was 20, I thought I'd missed the boat on things that I now think, wow, how did you think you'd miss the boat at 20? But that's partly the messaging of, get your qualifications, get your job. There's this idea that you have to be settled and sorted at 30, and it just isn't true. Some of the most successful people on paper of what traditionally was regarded as success didn't really get going into their 50s.
Yeah.
So I think even just asking yourself the question, what does success mean? It already is a good thing to do. Because some people have millions and it's not enough.
Yeah.
And to other people, that's like the pinnacle of success. And some people's success is about relationships. Some people's success is about home. Some people, it's a physical sporting activity. But I think if you hang too much on something outside of yourself, you run the risk of being disappointed regardless of what you do.
Well, I think that's a classic myth of success, isn't it? Most often you hear people who think, when I get my first million, or when I get that house, or I get that car, I'm going to be happy. It very rarely works out that way. A lot of people find that it's actually a real kind of like anticlimax when that thing comes. So
yeah, very true.
Another thing linked to success, which I always ask, which I think is interesting, is what skills do you think you have that have enabled you to be successful at what you do?
Skills. I mean, skill-wise, obviously things have changed over time. So what I'm good at is not necessarily what I was good at 20 years ago. I think the main thing I have is the ability to pick myself up and go again. I think this resilience thing is big. I don't think we really understand resilience. I mean, I didn't realise this until quite recently, that resilience comes from materials originally, from material science, and how long can you stretch the rubber band before it snaps, basically, or returns back to its original state without being changed. So resilience in people is all about how far can you stretch yourself, push yourself before you come back and you're still okay, essentially. And I think the ability to pick yourself up again and have another go, the ability to bounce back, the ability to overcome a challenge, the ability to keep looking and to keep moving, to keep exploring, to be curious, I think those are the things that have made the difference.
Yeah.
There were definitely times in my life when I thought this is hard, really hard, and I really struggled. I think the thing that got me through was that I didn't lose hope. I always thought there must be something better. It must get better from here. I think that if you are able to assume that something better is possible, that's a skill. And I think you have to teach yourself that to some degree.
Yeah, that's another interesting one, isn't it? Because that's like a positive mindset in a way. And again, I think all of these areas, and it's a subject that's come up quite a lot on this podcast. Again, it's like resilience. Is that something you can learn? Can you make yourself a more positive thinker?
I think you can build resilience, and I think you can question your thinking to make it more positive. But the hope thing was an interesting one, because that was at a time when I really was not a positive thinker. I really didn't see the silver lining. But there must have been something that said, don't stop here. There's got to be something else. The willingness to travel on. And I think that willingness to travel on has made a difference. But, I've got to be careful with that, because there are people who are really struggling with life who don't see the value in carrying on. That hope bit is the bit that they need, and other people can help with that. Yeah. I think when you're in that place, you can't necessarily always help yourself out of it.
No.
I think you can't positive talk yourself out of everything.
No, definitely not.
No.
I want to finish with a feature I call Life by Misadventure.
God.
And again, this is like, sometimes I think this is a really tricky question for people, but I think it's really interesting as well, because I know from my own personal experience, and we've talked about my adventures playing in bands and things like that, and I always think that there's so many lessons people learn from outside of the office or outside of their usual 9 to 5, whether you're into a strange activity or it might be travelling or whatever, it might be team sports or whatever. Just things that you learn by accident in strange places. So I want to ask, what lesson have you learned from an unexpected source?
I think you get lessons from all kinds of unexpected places, and I'll probably think of another 20 after I leave here today.
Yeah.
But the first one that comes to mind immediately is that I played roller derby for a little while. Now, if you've never come across roller derby, it's a contact sport on roller skates. I got into it maybe a bit later than I should have done, because I didn't bounce as much as maybe those around me who were younger did. So I was never great at it, but I enjoyed it for a while, and I liked being involved in roller derby. But one of the things about roller skating and contact sport is, first you have to be able to roller skate, then you have to learn the technique that goes with the actual game. And one of the things I really struggled with was turning 180 degrees fast. So if you're going at speed forward, turning back on yourself and being able to come back the other way. The reason I found this hard is because I think I was a bit scared of what would happen if I didn't turn, so I only kind of half turned. That's when the problems happen. And it's called a transition, and it's interesting because you often talk with children about the struggles of transition to a new school. In change management in business, it's about transition to a new way of working, and this is called a transition, this 180 degree turn. And what I realized is, in my head, in the split second before I had to say to myself, commit. If I didn't commit 100% to the turn, I ended up as a heap on the floor. You have to be willing to make the commitment. It's a bit like getting married. It's a bit like having children. There's no halfway house. You're either in and you've said yes, or you're not. And it's that same principle. The things in life you have to say, am I in this or am I not in this? You can't half-heartedly do a transition. In roller derby, on roller skates, there's a lot of things in life you have to ask yourself, am I in or am I not in? And I notice when I'm dabbling, or what people call procrastinating, I often think, what's my resistance? Am I committed or am I not committed here? That's been a really important lesson. I use that in lots of different ways. I sometimes have to say to myself, you're going to commit or you're not going to commit.
I absolutely love that answer. That's almost the perfect answer for this question. That's exactly the type of insight I was hoping to extract from people. Because
me on a pile on the floor in roller skates?
No, but it's so true, isn't it? Like, it's such a great visual as well to get people to understand that. And I think like that lesson of committing to something, you either commit to it or you don't. And the danger of dabbling is very obvious when you're travelling at speed on roller skates. I've always thought sports like that are just ridiculously dangerous, by the way. I was aware of the sport, but I think you're the first person I've actually met who's played it.
You might want to make people who are better at it than I was, but yeah, you have to, there's no halfway. You're moving. And I think in relationships it's like that. You can't be half in. You either want this to be better or you don't, which is why it's better to commit to a couple of people properly and really engage in it than to dabble around a little bit and not really bother. Because people will know, like you said, people will know if you're not really committed to how are you.
Yeah.
Because either commit to saying how are you, how you're feeling, and be there to hear the answer and commit to the moment, or don't. But because people will know when you're not really in it.
Well, that is a perfect way to round off the conversation. Sadly, that does bring us to the end. It's been so much fun chatting. We definitely could have talked all day. We might have to do another episode sometime down the line. We never got the chance to delve into Agatha Christie.
Oh, no. We'll come back for a good murder another day.
Exactly, that's another episode. But I did want to ask, just for the benefit of everyone, what are the best links for people to keep up with you and the work?
So the best place to find me is on LinkedIn. I'm also on Instagram, but I'm way more interactive on LinkedIn than I am on Instagram. I turn up there Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 8:45 in the morning. I do it consistently for a reason. So I commit, oddly, to being there 3 times a week. And I interact with people as much as I can. You can find me on my website, which is goldencatalyst.co.uk. My book is on Amazon. So again, that's got contact details in it for me as well. So there's lots of different ways to come and find me.
Brilliant. Well, I'm going to put all of those links, including the link to the book, in the description. Definitely recommend everyone to read it. It is a well worth reading. Well, thank you so much for coming along. It's been a really fun conversation.
I've really enjoyed myself. And yes, we could totally have another one. We could definitely come back another day.